So welcome back to Managerial Accounting. This is an extension of yesterday's class on Thursday. And what I want to do here is I want to review the journal entries associated with process costing. Now remember, we started in chapter 2 with job order costing, and we saw there how we traced material, labor, and overhead to the individual jobs, which called work in process. And we said in process costing, we're not going to have one work in process accounts. We're going to have work in process accounts for each production department. So what I want to do now is I want to illustrate the journal entries that we make in process costing. And before we do so, it's a good idea to kind of take stock of where we've been and what we know about the topic. So we know that we're going to purchase materials. So we're going to debit materials and we're going to credit accounts payable to show the purchase of materials. And then those materials are going to be transferred in to the various production departments. So if we have production department 1, production department 2, we're going to debit work in process production department 1, production department 2. And some of those materials may be indirect materials as well. So if we have indirect materials, things like that, they're going to go not directly into work in process. We know they're going to go into factory overhead. And later on, we're going to have to apply that factory overhead to not one work in process accounts, but 2. We know when we incur labor, we're used to in job order costing, tracing the labor to one work in process account. Here in chapter 3 in process costing, we're going to trace that labor into 2 work in process accounts. Right, so we got 2 work in process accounts, we got 2 factory overhead accounts, and we also have 2 accounts we use. Remember, when we apply overhead to work in process, we debit work in process and we credit the credit the overhead account. So in process costing, you're going to have likely going to have more than one. You're going to have at least 2 departments where we're going to transfer overhead costs to. Okay, and then just like in process costing and job order costing, remember we trace the good, the cost, the material, the labor, and the overhead to work in process. And then we transfer the process to the work in process to finished goods when the goods are finished. In process costing, what's going to happen is we're going to have one production department is generally going to sequentially is going to be before the other one. So I think if we were dealing with the ice cream company, we would have the work in process account for mixing, and then the costs would be accumulated there and transferred to the work in process account packaging. And then out of that account, they would be transferred to finished goods. And then once the goods are sold, they're transferred out of finished goods into cost of goods sold. So we'll go through that in more detail in a moment, but I wanted to have you that overview before I start to pull up the slides that I'm going to use to illustrate this topic. And these slides which I pull up are available to you as well. If you want to print out, stop here and print out your slides first and take attendance. Take notes. So let's see if I can find the slides. And where are the slides? There they are. And let's make this bigger. And we're going to illustrate the journal entries for process costing. Okay. So the first is the purchase of materials. So if you look at the second bullet point, we purchased milk, cream, sugar, packaging, and other indirect materials on account for $88,000. So here the entry looks the same as we did in job order costing. It's a debit to materials and a credit to accounts payable. It's transaction A. Transaction B, we reduced materials. There were requisitions for materials totaling $81,125. So that's the credit because we're reducing the asset account inventory. Materials inventory. And where did that go? Well, it went to work in process mixing, it went to work in process packaging. Those were for direct materials. Notice I got 2 work in process accounts. And some of it was indirect materials. So I've got a debit to factory overhead mixing and factory overhead packaging. Remember, when we incur factory overhead, of which indirect materials is an example, we don't put it directly into the production departments. We gather those costs first in factory overhead, and then later on we apply those to work in process. So there's the entry to record the requisition of materials. Notice the 2 work in process accounts, notice the 2 overhead accounts. Then they tell us with regard to our conversion costs, something near and dear to your heart with regard to those of you who are trying to master the concept of equivalent units. We incurred, we'll get to that a little bit later on. We incurred direct labor in mixing and packaging. So here, when we incur direct labor, we debit work in process mixing, work in process packaging. So that is an example of, in job order costing, we would have just debited work in process and credited whether pages payable. Here we've got two work in process accounts. So this represents the labor that was put into production. So again, you got two work in process accounts, mixing and packaging. So that's transaction C. We go all the way up to H. D, we incurred additional factory overhead. So we had depreciation on the equipment. So depreciation, there's my credit to accumulated depreciation. But in process costing, like in job order costing, rather than debiting depreciation expense, we treat this as overhead. And the depreciation that we had is segmented between factory overhead mixing and factory overhead packaging. Notice at this point, we haven't applied any factory overhead to the production department, to the mixing department and the packaging department. We've just gathered the costs. We gathered the costs of indirect materials here, and we gathered the cost of depreciation here. Now we're going to apply it in transaction E. We're going to apply the factory overhead, and we're going to apply it to the mixing department and packaging department. And we're not going to ask you to do the computations here. We give you the numbers. So packaging department was 7,225. And the other one, the packaging department, mixing was 7,275, and packaging was 3,500. So as we apply factory overhead to the departments here on the process costing, we debit work in process mixing, we debit work in process packaging. And notice we had maintained two separate overhead accounts. So we had credit factory overhead mixing and factory overhead packaging. Think of it's a good idea as you take notes on this is to cut up a little T account, call it factory overhead. And remember, factory overhead is debited when we incur factory overhead, such as indirect materials and depreciation. And it's credited when we apply the factory overhead, not to jobs here, what we said in job order costing, but we apply to the actual departments that we have under product costing. All right, so there's transaction E. Transaction F, so the flow of goods is we incur material, labor, and overhead in the various departments. At some point, the goods that are in mixing, which is where we mix all the ice cream together, it's where they have the big vats and stuff like that. We're mixing all the cream. There's a picture of the guy. Then we transfer those costs to packaging. So packaging is the final work in process account. So work in process goes first into mixing. And then when we're done with the mixing, we pass it on to the packaging. So we transferred 86,475 from the mixing department to the packaging department. They're both asset accounts work in process. So we reduce one, mixing, we reduce by 86,475, and we debit the work in process packaging. Now, packaging is the final department where the costs go before they are transferred to finished goods. And they tell us we transferred 106,000 out of the packaging department to finished goods. So the finished goods is the inventory account that we debit. So we debit finished goods for 106, and we credit work in process for 106 because we've reduced the work in process account. Okay. So in here, since we have two production departments, the costs are going to be accumulated in the mixing department. Then they're going to be transferred to the packaging department, which is going to incur its own costs as well. But then when the goods are actually finished in the packaging and they go into the finished goods, we debit the finished goods and we credit the packaging. Then here in the last one here, transaction H, we transferred goods out of finished goods. So we actually have to now record the cost of the goods that were sold. So we're debiting cost of goods sold for 107 and we're crediting finished goods for 107. Right, so there's the flow. It goes, we have the material, labor, and overhead we have to account for. It gets accumulated into two production departments. Then it gets transferred out of the mixing department into the packaging department. Then it gets transferred out of the packaging department into finished goods. And then finally it gets transferred out of finished goods into cost of goods sold. So those are the transactions A through H, and you're going to have a homework, a little practice exercise in class, and then there's likely to be a homework problem that's very similar to this. And you know, I always like to put journal entries on your exams, so you need to be familiar with these journal entries. So there's A through H here, And these journal entries are posted to the T account. So when you do, I think there is the exercise we're going to do in class in a moment. We're going to keep track of the cost, and we're only going to ask you to keep track of one work in process account, but you can see the flow. So these little letters here, look up at the T account materials. So you had the debit to purchases when you purchased materials. You had the credit to materials when you requisitioned the materials and transferred them to the various departments. Notice the flow of goods from factory overhead mixing, factory overhead packaging. Those are costs that are accumulated. So you had indirect materials in factory overhead mixing. You had depreciation in factory overhead mixing. You had a debit for indirect materials for factory overhead packaging, and you had a debit for factory for depreciation. And then look at the E. Those costs are then transferred. Those are applied, and notice the factory overhead applied to work in process mixing and work in process packaging. Okay. So all these journal entries that I make, A through H, need to be posted to T accounts. So you can see that they're posted to T accounts here. And when we do the class illustration in a few moments, we're going to have you keep track not of all of these accounts, but one of these work in process accounts. Okay. Before we get into the little activity here to see if we've mastered this stuff, I got to move my head. My head is in the way. It's not the first time a guy with a big head got in the way. So we use process costing system during the month to transfer completed goods of 95,000 ready to be sold out of the final assembly department. So it looks like we've got a work in process in a group called final assembly, and it looks like those costs were transferred to finished goods. So the question is, what is the journal entry that accompanies that? So think about what I said at the beginning. So we're going to, when the goods are ready to go, when we finish the manufacturing process, they go out of the final deposit, the department, which was the final assembly department, and they go into finished goods. So what we're looking for here is a debit to finished goods and a credit to work in process final assembly. That's what we're looking for. Always a good idea with multiple choice. Before you look at the answers, think of what the right answer is. And you can always kind of guess if you don't know what the right answer is. But if you think of what the right answer is and had confidence in your reasoning, then go looking for the entry. So we're looking for an entry that increases finished goods by 95,000 and reduces the final assembly department by 95,000. And if that's my lens, if that's my criteria, it looks like C is a pretty good guess. All right. So what we're going to do now is we are going to do the in-class exercise, which if I had more time, I would have done. I didn't want to keep you late here. We're going to do exercise 7 on page 125 of your textbook. And what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video here. Just pause it. Go to page 125, find the in-class exercise 7, the little practice exercise there, and see if you can do it. And when you do this exercise, remember what we're doing is we're transferring costs to the work in process filling department, and then we are gathering overhead and wages in the work in process filling department. And then we are transferring goods out of the filling department into costs out of the filling department into finished goods. So you want 3 journal entries, and that's the A part of the problem. And the B part of the problem, what we want to do is we want to do the transfer out of the filling department into finished goods. So let's go find that exercise. I think I can get out of here. Hope I can get out of here. And I hope I can pull this thing right up. And there we go. That wasn't too bad. So the cost of materials transferred into filling. So remember, you got 2 different departments here. You got blending and you got filling. And the filling department is going to have costs that are transferred out of the blending department. So it says the cost of materials transferred into the filling department of Lilac is $20,250. So that includes $6,000 from the blending department, and it includes $14,000 from materials from the storeroom. So you're going to have a figure out that one's going to have a journal entry. And then it says the conversion costs for the period were $6,372, which included factory overhead applied of $1,600 and direct labor of $4,772. So you're going to want to have a journal entry for that. And then the last one here is the cost transferred from finished goods for the period was $25,660. So you're going to have to transfer out of the filling department into the finished goods. So we're looking for 3 journal entries. That's what you're going to do in Part A. In Part B, we want you to determine the work in process of the filling department at the end of the period. So that end of the period would include the beginning balance of 2,200, which is the last sentence there in that little overview there. So there is your beginning inventory. And then you have various debits and credits to that, and you have to figure out what the balance is in work in process filling at the end of the period. So what I want you to do now, without further ado, put your do aside, pause the tape, and try to do this exercise. And I'll give you a few minutes to do this exercise. I'd suggest you pause the tape here. It should take you more than, don't spend more than 10 minutes on this. Do some hard thinking about it. Come up, write down what you think the answers are, and then I'll walk you through what the actual answers are. Okay, so take a 10-minute break here, do Part A and do Part B. And after you've done pausing the tape and you finished it, come on back. I'm not going to have little background music for 10 minutes. I'm going to just say, stop the tape here, pause it, and come back in 10 minutes. And good luck. Okay, so I hope you've paused the 10 minutes and have tried this on your own. So here are the 3 journal entries as promised. So you transferred 20,250 worth of cost into the filling department, and that came from work in process. Some of that was a transfer of cost in from the materials from the blending department, and some of it was materials out of the storeroom. So it's a debit to work in process filling. That's where we transfer the costs. And those costs came from the blending department and from the materials, the raw materials inventory. That was the first transaction. And the second one is you incurred costs in the filling department, and you incurred factory, you transferred costs there. You had factory overhead of 1,600. So that was transferred to, so you have the debit to work in process filling includes the combined amount. These are your conversion costs, the combined amount of wages and the combined amount of overhead. And notice it's a credit to factory. It didn't ask us for the entries here, but we would have previously accumulated, not included in this particular exercise, it would have accumulated costs in factory overhead filling. So now we're applying. So we're applying to the filling department work in process. We're applying both the factory overhead and the wages. And then when the goods are transferred out of work in process filling, they're transferred into finished goods. So you debit finished goods and you credit work in process filling. So these are the 3 journal entries that are required. If you came up with something wrong, you might want to go back, look at the slides that relate to this, look at my little mini lecture, and make sure you understand where these various journal entries came from. You will see journal entries in the homework, and you will see journal entries on the exam. And the journal entries could be for both job order costing and process costing, so you need to be mastered both. All right, so that was Part A. Part B was determine the balance of work in process filling at the end of the period. Remember when I had the slides up, I had all the different T accounts, and you probably looked and said, oh my God, how am I going to keep track of all that detail? Well, we're not asking you to keep track of all that detail here. We're asking you to determine the balance in the work in process in the filling department at the end of the period. And that balance would be the beginning balance plus all the various debits and credits that you had to work in process filling. So what you had was you had 3,000, you had the balance is 3,162. Where did that come from? The 2,200 was the beginning balance of work in process filling. The 20,250 is from the first entry. The 6,302 is from the second entry. And the 25,660 is from the third entry. So your balance, the answer to B is your balance in work in process filling department is 3,162. Okay, so I hope you found that review useful. So again, it's a good idea when you do journal entries is to get a mental picture, a picture in your head in terms of what the journal entries are. So you're going to have journal entries. What's going to be different in process costing than job order costing is you're going to, rather than transferring cost to work in process, you're going to have work in process for 2 production departments. Rather than having 1 factory overhead account, you're going to have factory overhead accounts for both the two production departments. Like with job order costing, when you transfer goods from work in process to the final inventory, when the costs are finished, you're going to debit the the finished goods, and you're going to credit the work in process. What's going to be different here is you got two work in process, so accounts, so you need to determine what the last work in process account was. All right, so I thank you. I hope you found that little video useful. It'll help you with the exercise in class. It'll help you in the homework. It'll help you on the exam. And I'm going to do one more little mini lecture for you. Okay, so we'll see you shortly, and come on back, and we'll see you soon. Hasta luego.